Well, it's brilliant to have Nigel Kushner from W Legal with us today. He's going to talk to us all things furloughing. So Nigel, first question first. What is furloughing?
Right, well, not many people have heard of furloughing until very recently. A furloughed worker is someone who is unable to work due to the coronavirus pandemic because their places of work have been forced to close or because they are unable to do their job. They are absolutely not people who have been made redundant. Some people may be delighted to be furloughed, and we can talk about those types of people. And for others, it will be very impractical for their employers to make them become furloughed, and we can discuss that why in a moment. But the way it works is if you are furloughed, your employer can access support to continue paying part or all of your wages. And the whole point of it is that it's designed to avoid redundancy. So it is far from making people redundant. There will be up to £2,500 a month able to be paid to those who are unable to work. And it's part of what is called the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, CJRS. So employers who wish to access this should speak with their employees about classifying them as a furloughed worker. It means they're kept on the payroll rather than being laid off. And according to the government, furloughed staff should not undertake any work whatsoever for their employer during the scheme. The employer can claim up to 80% of wages with a limit of £2,500 per month. To qualify, I again emphasize you cannot undertake any work for your employer. You must put your feet up. You may well be able to work for others or do your own part-time self-employed work, but of course only if your current employment contract provides for this and allows it and doesn't prevent it. So let's take an example. You are an employee and you earn £2,500 per month, and you usually work in an office and you're not allowed to go to your office to do your job because the government has said you're not allowed to. It's not necessary for you to physically be present at your office to do the work. You could be working in a pub, you could be working in an office, and your employer just doesn't have any work coming in because no one's giving them any work. What is the employer's choices? The employer can choose to make you redundant, which is exactly what the government is seeking to avoid. And instead, what will happen is that the government allows the employer to say to the employee, you are still an employee, sit at home, don't do anything at all, and essentially the government are going to pay your salary if you're not, of course, earning up to £2,500 per month. And you sit at home for 3 months, or it could be 3 weeks. It can go in 3-week tranches until such time for at least 3 months, and it may be extended, as your employer says you're no longer furloughed. You sit at home, twiddle your thumbs, of course, make use of your time, do online training courses, enjoy spending time with your family. And when your furlough ends, you are still employed. You still have your contract of employment, and the government hope that everyone is going to go back to their jobs. So it is far from being made redundant. Now, the employer cannot force you to become furloughed. You have a choice. You could say, I don't want to be furloughed. I actually want to receive the same amount of money and I want to continue doing my job. Well, that wouldn't be a very wise decision because the employer may well say, well, I'm afraid the alternative is that we have to make you redundant because we can't afford to pay you. So it would be most unusual if anyone in their right mind who is going to receive a similar or the same revenue or salary, albeit paid from someone else, to not take this up. Now, where it becomes tricky is if an employer has an employee and let's say that their monthly salary is £4,000 a month. Well, the employer can only access £2,500 per month.
Mhm.
So the employer can say to the employee, we can give you £2,500 per month, and we're going to top it up, and we're going to pay the balance £1,500 a month, so you're going to be furloughed. The employee has a choice, and again, it's very likely the employee will agree to that. But what happens if the employer turns around to the employee and says, listen, we like you very much, we have no money at the moment, we can put you on furlough, we can only give you £2,500 a month because that's what the government's going to give. I'm afraid we can't give you the balance £1,500 per month. You need the employee's consent. The employee cannot be forced to take furlough if he is going to be paid less than he would otherwise be paid. You need his consent. And again, it's very difficult for employers. What are they going to do? Everyone is going through that thought process at the moment. You can't force someone to become furloughed unless you're going to pay them everything they would otherwise be paid. And does an employer want his employee to sit and do nothing and twiddle his thumbs for up to 3 months and still have to fork out money from them or not? That's the big difficulty. And it's only really working well from what I've seen for those people who are earning up to £2,500 per month. Another thing that I've seen employers do, and I was advising someone this morning about this, is rather than furloughing anyone, they want to go to their staff and say, guys, please carry on working, but take a 30% reduction in pay for the next 3 months. That gives the employer more flexibility because they can have all their employees working for them still. Don't forget, if you're furloughed, you can't pick up a pen for your employer. So I'm actually seeing more employers turn around and say to their staff, guys, we want to work, we want to keep you, we want to retain you for the next 3 months. Please, can you agree that you'll take a 20 or 30% reduction? You always need employees' agreement for that. Some may say yes, some may say no. Again, you're in the same problem as an employee if you say no, because they might make you redundant. Now, any employer who does make people redundant needs to be very careful indeed, make sure they are not discriminating, they need to make sure that they have consulted in an appropriate way.
Yeah. And so I think this is one of the key things at the moment. Obviously, we're in a time of a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, a lot of business owners and senior management teams are really under the cosh. What's the best way for an employer to approach somebody about furloughing them or even reducing the salary? What are your sort of top tips?
Well, the way I would do it is to sit down in advance, and the directors, the management, the people making the decisions need to go through their cash flow very, very carefully. Once they've done that as stage one, they can then look and take a close look at the people they need, the people they don't need, what they can afford, what they can't afford. And if they do that exercise carefully at the outset, then that makes the consultation a lot easier. When you sit down with staff, it's my suggestion that a generic, soft, elegant email goes out to all the staff, and that you then pick up the phone one by one to them, and of course let them know in their email, we will call you at such and such a time later today to discuss further. When you do discuss anything with an employee who is becoming furloughed, you need to explain that you have thought this through very carefully. You have formed the legal view that you are entitled to do this. You then need to really emphasize to the employee that they are valued. They are not losing their job. They are not being made redundant. They will retain, payment up to £2,500 per month. And if they're earning £2,500 per month or less, they have no choice. You're saying to them, we like you. This is fantastic for you. Use this time to spend time with your family and friends. You've got a job waiting for you as things stand when you come back. And we fully anticipate that you will come back rested with vigor and loyal to the company, because we are loyal to you. This isn't us punishing you. This is us making the best of a very difficult situation because we care about you. We could have turned around and made you redundant, but we're not doing that. We don't have to do that. We hope we will get through this, together. You then have to give them very careful instructions as to the information that they will need, how the payments will be made, perhaps give them a lot of the references and information that they'll need, the various national insurance numbers. You want to make life easy for them. And with just a little bit of effort, an employer can really put an employee's mind at rest. And also to tell the employee that they will sort of receive updates every so often. They can't work for the company, but I don't see why you can't let them know that you're still alive, you're still around. This is when the furlough is going to end. This is when we'll give you an update. Keep them happy. It's up to them if they want to do any self-employed work. If you do have a clause in your contract with your employees, and most employers do, because bog standard contracts contain this clause. It says you can't do any work for anyone else whilst you're employed by us. You can choose, if you wish, to waive that and say to them, go on courses, learn this, learn that, better yourself, enjoy spending time with your family and friends. That's my own perception as to how it should be approached.
Yeah. Brilliant. And my understanding is, and do correct me if I'm wrong, this is probably quite a key thing, is that somebody can do volunteer work and they can do training or education stuff, and that's not precluded by being furloughed.
No, it's my understanding that that's not precluded. You should probably think with greater care if you're going to train yourself on something that is going to improve your job or be absolutely relevant to your job. But if it's sort of tangentially related to it, I imagine that would be okay. It's a great opportunity.
And my last... Yeah, oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for your time. My last question, if I may, is can you just talk a little bit about force majeure and the frustration?
Yes. Force majeure is a clause in a contract which says as follows. If a party is unable to perform this contract because of unforeseen events which are outside of its control, then you don't need to perform it and you are relieved of your liability, which sounds fantastic. And I can tell you that almost every company in the country is currently looking through every one of their contracts to see if they can wriggle out or avoid paying under them or providing services because they can't or don't want to, usually because they're simply unable to. Now, the important thing about force majeure is that you've got to do what it says on the tin. If there's no force majeure clause in your contract, you can't rely on it. So in the last week, I have had clients come to me with force majeure clauses which say, for example, if there is an act which prevents you from performing the contract, and that act relates to a riot, then you are relieved through performance. Well, that doesn't help you if you have a pandemic, because it doesn't say the words pandemic. I have other contracts which are much better drafted, and they will say things like, if there is anything that happens that is outside of our control and which is unforeseen, including but not limited to a pandemic, and that might name another 20 types of things that could happen, then you don't need to perform. Sometimes it says the word pandemic, which is great, but it then says you've got to be prevented from performing because of the pandemic. Others may say you've got to be hindered from performing. Now, there's a very big difference between being hindered in doing something and being legally prevented from doing something. So you've got to look at these clauses really very carefully. You know, a lot of people are looking at office licenses if they are in serviced offices, and you've just got to look at the contract and do what it says on the tin. Now, if you have no force majeure clause, then you might rely on a very old doctrine of what we call frustration, which exists in contracts. Let me explain what frustration is. It applies whether or not it will apply frustration only if you don't have a force majeure clause. The contract will have to be incapable of being performed. And one of the last times there was case law on this, actually, was in the Hong Kong courts, which we think the English courts would follow, in relation to the SARS virus, where someone tried to wriggle out of rental obligations on the basis of the SARS virus, and the courts there held that because the SARS virus was only in force for, I think, 3 weeks at the time frustration was invoked, that this didn't amount to frustration because it was too short term. And we're in this strange position where the government has ordered a lockdown for, I think, 3 weeks at the moment. Everyone knows and anticipates it's obviously going to be longer than 3 weeks. Where does that leave us? What is the reality today? And I noted that I think one of the deputy government medical advisors announced a couple of days ago that it could be up to 6 months. Statements like that made publicly can completely change the legal position with respect to contracts relying on things such as frustration. All you can do is look at your contract, number one, see what your force majeure clause says, and do what it says on the tin. Follow what it says. Can you rely on it or can't you? If you don't have a force majeure clause, then you've got to look at the doctrine of frustration, which, as I say, is a little trickier, but I think it will be tested very soon in the courts, and then people will follow. Of course, everyone's in a commercial relationship. Everyone is struggling. Sit down and negotiate in good faith, because your counterpart will want to retain a relationship with you, hopefully. They may agree a reduction. So if you're in a serviced office, ask if you can have a reduction of, say, 50% in your rent. They may or may not agree it. They may negotiate with you. They may say, well, we'll just give you further time to pay. And you've just got to sit down and look at your cash flow, see where you are. And if it's the best you're going to get, it's either going to work or it isn't going to work. But hopefully it will work, and that is an awful lot better than entering into litigious correspondence, hiring someone like myself. And as cheap and as good as I am, I'm still very costly if you're going to go down the court route. Is that really where you want to be? Probably not. So I would urge and encourage everyone, look at all your suppliers, pick up the phone to them all, write to them, use the relationship you might have built up with them, and see if you can get a better deal. I'm doing the same thing, and we should all be doing that.
Nigel, thank you so much for your time. I've learned so much just even in the last 15, 20 minutes. This has been brilliant. Thank you so much. And we're going to put your details along with this video. So if someone wants to get in touch with you, I'm sure they'll be able to follow through the links below. Thank you.
Thanks.